Greetings, everyone, and welcome to No BS Baking. You got JP here, and today I want to talk about the interplay of ingredients within dough. Now, how one ingredient affects another, and more importantly, understanding the effect so you can anticipate what you expect the dough is going to do, or adjust it so it falls in line with exactly what you want it to do. When I'm looking for inspiration for my videos, I always like to check out Reddit. I'm assured to find a new baker like this poor fella that got this 4 ingredient recipe from the site and created this product. Now, can you imagine how frustrated he was? So to help him out, I added all the gram weights and percentages so he could understand what this recipe was actually telling him. And if you've been following my channel, you can see that this is a nightmare recipe for a beginner baker. I mean, let's get real. 3.3% salt? Come on, that quantity is ridiculous. 75% hydration for a new beginning baker? Crazy. And 1.9% instant yeast. Well, the only reason that this is so high is because the salt is completely off the charts. This recipe, in my opinion, is embarrassing and has no place to be fitted with titles like this. So, after hours of work and failing like this can be so discouraging, but there are lessons to be learned. Baking is not about weights and measures. Weights are the numerical expression for the required amount of an ingredient based on percentages. So for the rest of this video, we'll be talking in baker's percent to better explain functions of ingredients and their interplay within a dough or batter. So we know that the amount of water used is based on both the flour we're using and its protein content, usually, and of course the product you're creating. And this hydration generally falls into a long-established range percent based on flour. Now, by converting a recipe, authors recommend hydration to a percentage you can quickly assess the suitability for your flour type and the desired product. Okay, so I'm just going to use the previous example where they actually really only state 3 cups of flour. So let's assume you have AP flour and want to use it. I mean, there's nothing in the recipe that says not to, right? So you have a 75% hydration dough making a simple beginner pan bread, and you're going to use AP flour. Now, I'm not saying that this is impossible. It's totally workable. And if you're experienced and if you have a strong AP. But what about those of you that don't have 12% AP flour and you're dealing with 9 or 10%? Most likely, disaster. Now, if you search online, you'll find generic recommendations that can span from 50% to 70% hydration or higher with AP. So, where is it? The answer is, if in doubt, shoot right in the middle at around 60% and then adjust on your next batch. A stiffer dough will still generally yield a product, maybe a bit too dense, maybe it took a little longer to rise, but a loaf nonetheless. A lot of water pushing the limits for the product you're trying to make, well, this can just end up in pancakes. So where I'm going with this is that whatever ingredient you're using, you could find a common usage range in percent online. Always start in the low to middle range on your first go. Properly made bakery items are always built by percent as a ratio of flour. Before we talk about more complex interactions, let's use salt and yeast as a great example. All bakers know that 2% salt in breads is a standard. Rarely will you ever see salt above 2.5%. 2% was established scientifically for yeast-raised products to control fermentation speed and for the gluten strengthening and tightening effect that salt has in a dough system. This 2% salt standard directly correlates with established yeast usage, typically 1% for instant yeast, 1.25% for active dry yeast, and around 2% for cake or fresh yeast. This interconnectedness allows bakers to manage processing and fermentation times, ensuring optimal product development. Because of this interplay, as salt is reduced in the formula, yeast is also generally reduced. Or in the instance with the fresh loaf recipe, 3.3% salt was used, so double the yeast was used, which is technically makes sense if your plan was to create salt bread. Now, unlike the beginner bread we looked at, the chances are good you'll put other things in your bread, like maybe olive oil, butter, sugar, or honey. Now, yeast primarily consumes sugar as a food source. While a small amount of sugar speeds up fermentation, too much can actually dehydrate the yeast cells and slow down their activity. This starts to be noticeable at around 5%. So, if sugar's increased above 5%, then yeast is generally increased. The 5% rule holds true for other ingredients in the same way, and additionally for others in a different way. As an example, when oils and fats are used above 5%, mix times require an increase due to the oil interfering with gluten development by coating the flour particles. From both a flour and yeast perspective, high amounts of oil delays their ability to use available water, which can result in a slightly slower or delayed development or rise times. Now, this is relatable common sense, really. High oil, a lot of things slipping and sliding around, and oil has a repelling effect on water, so it makes sense that water's uptake may be delayed. So, how much yeast do I need to adjust? Are there actual scientific factors which provide guidelines on how much yeast needs to be adjusted when using these ingredients above 5%? The answer is yes. Now, here I'm using the Baking Assistant calculator, the low end of the factors for adjustment to stay cautious. So my base was 1% yeast. I'm using 8% sugar and 8% fat. So the adjustment to 1.5% yeast seems logical and will provide a good start point. Beyond the ingredients that we just talked about, now there's other ingredients that can impact leavening. High amounts of acid, like vinegar or lime juice, cocoa powder or molasses, can hinder the rise in both yeast leavened and chemically leavened baked goods. Bakers often considered adding more yeast when these ingredients are used at higher than common or standard ranges. Additionally, higher levels of eggs, dairy, spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, maybe alcohol used in holiday breads, preservatives like calcium propionate or even vinegar, or if the recipe is just stacked too much with enzyme. As an example, you've got enzymes in your flour already. Then you add a diastatic malt and possibly maybe even a dough improver. Now, too much enzyme can limit yeast access to food, slowing down fermentation. The addition of proteins like soy, whey, rice, and a host of other high protein and fiber ingredients can influence yeast's ability to perform, often requiring increases in both yeast and water. Now, understanding how different ingredients interact with yeast empowers you to effectively assess the recipe's yeast strategy. Failing to properly consider yeast levels as a percent of flour in light of these additions can lead to frustrating results like a slow rise, dense texture, low volume, poor oven spring. By recognizing these ingredient effects, you can troubleshoot with confidence, realizing the problem could be as simple as yeast balance, not necessarily baking technique or processing mistakes. So, we've talked about a number of ingredients that directly or indirectly affect yeast. Now, let's talk about the 25% guideline. This guideline states that under normal conditions, you can generally add about 25% based on flour of another ingredient with minimal impact on baking performance, providing you account for the hydration and any mix time adjustments that are required. Now, many recipes often go much higher than this. However, above 25%, it becomes a bit more important to understand what this recipe is telling you. Or you can just jump in blind, wing it, and hope for the best. In most cases, the aforementioned holds true. But just remember, when adding abrasive fibers like bran, crushed grains and seeds, or even some of the more gritty nut flours, it is important to remember that these types of ingredients can actually have a reverse effect. whereby they can shear or tear the gluten network, weakening the dough and reducing the gas retention capabilities. Now, this is why when abrasive ingredients are added, mix times are generally reduced. This is why a little bit of pre-baking research can save you a lot of grief by Googling more or less mix time when using, say, almond flour as an example. Now, this kind of goes without saying. Don't just throw in 25% of pea flour as an example because you want nutrition boost. Flavor and texture, I would assume, are important, so be sure to look into common ranges for use and maybe a few recipes using the ingredient for reference. Many of these ingredients are used at levels well below 25% due to the negative effect they can have on everything, including baking performance. You don't want product that you can't or don't want to eat at the end of the bake day, so be careful what you're adding and how much of it. Understanding what to expect from an ingredient in a recipe and how they will potentially interact starts with looking at them as a percent of flour. I've talked about this in many of my videos. However, to summarize this from an ingredient standpoint, I grabbed a recipe from the web to once again demonstrate how exploding it out to grams and percent tells you a lot. This recipe has a whopping 66% of other goodies in it and will require some careful attention through mixing and processing. Hydration is high, sugar and fat is moderately high, salt is high, and yeast is almost triple that of standard. Now, does it make sense? Let's look at this. So with respect to hydration of the dough, things kind of all fall in line when you look at it logically. Between all the ingredients listed, you can see that just by simply thinking about the hydration requirements each ingredient will want, the numbers all begin to add up, and 95% seems a reasonable hydration plan. So the real anomaly here seems to be yeast at 2.8%. I mean, wow, that's a lot. Sugar's at 7%, so we need to increase yeast. Salt is at 2.5, so we know we need to increase it a bit more. Flour, oats, wheat germ, and raisins will all be competing for water, so we can expect this may delay the yeast, so let's increase it a bit for that. Now we have fat at 7%, coating everything, so that will delay yeast activity. And then we have all buttermilk in the recipe, which also has a minor inhibiting effect on yeast. So we add all this up, and the 2.8% is logical and partly designed for assuring a quick rise for home bakers. This recipe is scientifically sound, as it should be for this large reputable company. Now, while you need to adjust your specific ingredients, the core formula is professionally developed. Many recipes that you will find online will not be as reliable, and even some that end in disaster. So understanding ingredient ratios and how they translate to weight is crucial for not only understanding ingredients and their common use ranges, but also for ensuring consistent baking success.
Now, obviously, trying to cover off every single ingredient in the full spectrum of baking and its interactions with other ingredients is difficult in a 13-minute video. But what I will say is the main takeaway here is about looking at your recipes and converting everything to percent. Percent is what tells you really what the recipe is going to do and how it's expected to perform. And you can search stuff like what is the common percent of soy flour that's added into bread, and you'll get a range. By working with percents, you get a way better understanding of not only the formulas you're building, but formulas that other people have built. It's through these percentages that you ultimately can determine whether you are in the ballpark or this recipe is out to lunch. Now, be careful where you go and search for this information, as it can vary widely from one resource to another. I always like to go to good quality research portals or industry resources to try to find the best information. However, keep that in mind that if you don't want to do all of that work, then be sure to just pick up the Baking Assistant. It has all of that information, gets into details about everything, and it will really, really help you understand and sort all of this stuff out. So, until next time, no BS baking.